My name is Claire Beaumont. I'm 35 years old, and 3 weeks ago, at a Thanksgiving table set for 19 people, my father slid a manila envelope across the linen tablecloth and told me to sign the papers inside before dessert. The envelope held a voluntary resignation letter and an uncompensated transfer of my membership interest in Beaumont and Reeve Millwork back to the company. My mother had already poured me a glass of the good Sancerre. My brother Trent was smiling the way he smiles when he thinks he's already won. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I set the envelope down next to my water glass and asked my father, very quietly, if Brett Holloway had reviewed the documents. Brett is the outside business advisor my grandfather hired in 2011. Brett was sitting at the far end of the table, 2 seats down from my Aunt Louisa, holding a roll he hadn't buttered yet. My father said Brett didn't need to review them. My father said this was a family matter. That was his mistake. Because the envelope sitting next to my water glass was not the only paperwork at that table. In my black leather portfolio, tucked under my chair, was a 22-page document dated April 17th, 2017. It was notarized. It was filed with the Secretary of State. It had 4 signatures on it, including my father's, and it assigned me, in writing, with an anti-dilution clause and a right of first refusal, 40% of the membership interest in Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, LLC. I had signed a cashier's check for $480,000 that same day, every penny of my grandfather's inheritance. My parents had forgotten. Before I tell you what happened when I opened that portfolio, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these stories. Drop your city and your local time in the comments so I know where you're listening from tonight. I love reading those. Now let me take you back to the spring of 2017, to the day I handed my father a check that built the new Beaumont and Reeve fabrication plant. And nobody at this Thanksgiving table, not one of them, remembers that I did. My grandfather, Harlan Beaumont, died in February of 2017. He left me $480,000 in a regular brokerage account and a handwritten letter that I still have in my desk drawer. The letter said in his steady engineer's handwriting, "Claire, this is not for a house, not for a car. This is for whatever you decide is worth building. Harlan." I was 26 years old. I had a master's in accounting from Vanderbilt and 3 years at a Big Four firm in Nashville. I had just passed my CPA. I was not, by any definition, a person who made impulsive decisions with money. I spent 3 weeks thinking about Grandpa Harlan's letter. Then I drove home to Asheville, sat across from my father in his office at the old Beaumont and Reeve shop on Riverside Drive, and told him I wanted to invest the entire $480,000 into the company. My father cried. This part matters, so I'm going to tell it carefully. He was 49 years old that spring, and Beaumont and Reeve was 2 payrolls away from a bankruptcy filing he hadn't told my mother about yet. A supplier had defaulted, a high-end residential client had disputed an invoice, and the line of credit at First Piedmont was drawing down faster than the receivables were coming in. My father sat at his desk and cried and said, "Claire, if you do this, we are saving this company together." I said, "I'm not giving you the money, Dad. I'm buying into the company." He said, Of course you are." I drove to Charlotte the next morning and retained a business attorney named Evan Priestley. I paid him out of pocket.
Evan drafted the paperwork, an amended operating agreement, a capital contribution schedule, a 40% membership interest with anti-dilution protection, a right of first refusal on any sale or transfer, a quarterly financial reporting obligation, and a tag-along provision. We closed on April 17, 2017, in Evan's conference room in Charlotte. My father signed. My mother Lorraine signed as the other existing member. Evan signed as the drafting attorney. The notary signed. The filing with the North Carolina Secretary of State went in the next morning. I wired $480,000 from Grandpa Harlan's brokerage account into the Beaumont and Reeve operating account at 11:47 a.m. that same day. I have the confirmation. I have the cashier's check stub. I have every single filing. I keep all of it because I am a certified public accountant, and paper is my first language. 2 weeks later, I gave my notice at the Big Four firm in Nashville, packed my apartment into a U-Haul, and drove 4 hours east to Asheville to become the chief financial officer of my family's cabinet and architectural millwork company. I have been the CFO of Beaumont and Reeve for 8 years and 7 months. In those 8 years, I restructured the line of credit. I renegotiated every supplier contract. I implemented a cost accounting system that tracked job margin by foreman and by product line. I hired a controller. I built a dashboard that let my father see in real time the gross margin on every custom kitchen we shipped. I am the reason Beaumont and Reeve now has 41 employees instead of 11, and a 22,000 square foot fabrication plant in South Asheville, and a pre-construction pipeline that is booked through the third quarter of next year. Revenue when I joined, $2.1 million. Revenue last year, $14.3 million. I am also, and this matters, the reason my younger brother Trent has a job. Trent is 31. He is the Vice President of Business Development, a title I objected to in writing in 2021 and lost. He closes deals. He is very charming. He has taken home, since my father installed him in his office in 2019, roughly $1.4 million in compensation. He has never once, in 4 years, asked me a clarifying question about a number. My mother runs what she calls the showroom and what I call accounts payable. She is 63. She has a real estate license she has not used in 12 years, and she refers to the company as ours, meaning her and my father. When she says ours, she does not mean mine. Let me tell you what being overlooked looks like when you are the person who signed the check. The week before Thanksgiving, I was sitting in my office above the fabrication floor, reviewing a quarter-end tax provision, when Trent walked in without knocking and told me he was flying to Charlotte the following Tuesday to have lunch with a man named Peter Lansdowne. I knew the name. Peter Lansdowne is a principal at a regional private equity firm called Southmark Capital that has been rolling up architectural millwork companies in the Southeast since 2022. I said, Trent, what's the meeting about? He said, Dad wants to explore strategic options. I said, since when? He said, since a while. I asked to see the NDA. He told me there wasn't one yet. I asked to see any correspondence. He said there wasn't any correspondence, just a couple of phone calls. I asked him why, as the CFO of the company, I had not been included in any of these phone calls. He smiled, the way he smiles when he is about to say something he has practiced. He said, Claire, Dad wanted to keep it informal until there was something real to look at. I did not scream. I did not slam my laptop shut. I walked down the hallway to my father's office, closed the door behind me, and asked him if he was exploring the sale of the company. My father looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "We're just having conversations, Claire. Nothing has been decided." I said, "I am the CFO. I am a member. I have a 40% interest. You cannot have a conversation about a sale of this company without me." My father took his reading glasses off, folded them, and placed them on top of a binder. Then he said the sentence that I have been turning over in my head for 17 days. He said, "Claire, the company was always going to go to Trent. You know that." I counted. 8 seconds of silence. I counted. Then I said, "I'll see you at Thanksgiving." I walked back to my office, closed my door, and sat down in my desk chair. My hands were not shaking. My hands were perfectly steady. Something in my chest went still. I picked up the phone and called Evan Priestley in Charlotte. Evan Priestley is 61 years old. He has been a business attorney for 34 years. He has a framed degree from UNC Law on the wall behind his desk and a Bruce Springsteen record propped up next to it that I have never asked about. When I called him, his assistant Denise put me through in under 90 seconds, which is how long it took me to explain what Trent had said. Evan said, "Claire, walk me through this slowly." I walked him through it slowly. The Lansdowne lunch, the absence of NDAs, my father's sentence about the company going to Trent, the fact that I had not been copied on a single communication. When I finished, Evan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Claire, pull up the operating agreement. I want to make sure you remember what's in it." I pulled it up on my second monitor. Evan walked me through the document I had signed 8.5 years earlier, as though I were a brand new client. Section 4.2, Tag-along rights. Section 4.3, right of first refusal on any transfer of membership interest. Section 6.1, quarterly financial reporting to all members. Section 7.2, unanimous consent required for sale of substantially all assets. Section 9.1, anti-dilution protection in the event of additional capital contribution. Evan said, "Claire, have your parents held a single member meeting in the last 3 years where any of these provisions was discussed?" I said, "No." Evan said, "Have they provided you with the quarterly financial reporting required under 6.1? I said, "I prepare it, Evan. I prepare it for myself." Evan said, "Have they obtained your unanimous consent for anything?" I said, "They have not obtained my consent for anything in 8 years. Evan said, "Claire, I need you to do something for me. I need you to come to Charlotte this Friday. Bring the original operating agreement. Bring every quarterly financial statement you have prepared for the last 3 fiscal years. Bring the minutes of every member meeting, or more importantly, the absence of them. Bring your capital contribution records and every wire confirmation. Bring everything." I said, "What are we doing?" Evan said, "We are going to decide whether we file a notice of derivative action before Thanksgiving or after. Because Claire, and I want you to hear this clearly, if there is a pending transaction with Southmark Capital and you have not been notified, your parents and your brother are
right now in breach of their fiduciary duty to you as a member. And if there is a signed letter of intent, we may have already crossed into actionable territory. I said, I'll be there Friday at 10. Evan said, one more thing, Claire. When did your father say the company was always going to go to Trent? I said, Tuesday. Evan said, did anyone witness that conversation? I said, no. But I wrote it down in my notebook the minute I got back to my office, with the timestamp. Evan said, that's my girl. I want to pause here for a second. If you have ever been the person in your family who quietly held everything together, who paid the bills, kept the receipts, did the work nobody thanked you for, and then watched the credit go to someone else, I see you. Drop a comment and tell me the one thing you did that your family never acknowledged. And if this story is hitting close to home, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what happens when I open that portfolio on Thanksgiving is not the reveal. The reveal is what the paperwork does to Beaumont and Reeve Millwork by the following Monday morning. Let me take you to Charlotte. Friday morning, I drove the 2 hours east on I-40 with a banker's box on my passenger seat. Inside the box, the original executed operating agreement with all 4 signatures and the Secretary of State filing stamp. The wire confirmation for $480,000. 34 quarterly financial statements I had prepared myself. A flash drive with every board and member communication I had ever received, and my own handwritten notebook from Tuesday with the time-stamped entry that read 4:17 p.m. Dad said the company was always going to go to Trent. I arrived at Priestley & Goss at 9:52. Denise brought me coffee. Evan came out of his office in a gray suit and a tie I recognized. I had given it to him for his 60th birthday, and led me back to the same conference room where, in 2017, I had signed the agreement that was now sitting in my lap. He had already pulled up the company records on the North Carolina Secretary of State website. He walked me through them on the wall monitor. Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, LLC. Members on file: Howard L. Beaumont, my father, 30%. Lorraine M. Beaumont, my mother, 30%. Claire E. Beaumont, me, 40%. The original filing from April 2017. No amendments, no transfers, nothing. Evan said, Claire, as of this morning on the public record, you own 40% of this company. Not 39, not 35, 40. The state of North Carolina has no knowledge that any of this has changed. Now let me ask you something. Has anyone, your father, your mother, your brother, ever asked you to sign a document transferring or reducing your interest? I said, no. He said, has anyone asked you to sign an amended operating agreement? I said, no. He said, has anyone asked you to sign a resignation as CFO or as a member? I said, not yet. Evan looked at me. Why do you say not yet? I said, because my mother sent out the Thanksgiving dinner invitation on Sunday, and the RSVP list includes Brett Holloway. Brett has not been to a Beaumont Thanksgiving in 7 years. Evan put down his pen. He said, Claire, they're going to ask you to sign something at Thanksgiving. I said, I know. He said, do you want to file the derivative action before Thanksgiving? Or do you want to walk into that dinner and let them hand you the paperwork themselves? I thought about it for exactly 1 minute. Then I said, Evan, I want to walk into that dinner. I want to see what they put in front of me. And I want you to have the derivative action ready to file at 9 o'clock the following Monday morning. I also want you to have a cease and desist letter ready for Southmark Capital. And I want a letter to First Piedmont Bank on the line of credit, because if my parents have been negotiating a sale without my consent, I want that credit facility reviewed for a default trigger under the change of control clause I wrote into the 2019 renewal. Evan smiled. It was not a big smile. It was the professional smile of a man who has been waiting a long time to file something satisfying.
He said, "Claire, I'm going to need you to walk into that dinner like nothing is happening. Can you do that?" I said, "I have been doing that for 8 years." I drove back to Asheville that Friday afternoon with a folder of draft filings in my passenger seat and a very clear plan in my head. Evan would have everything ready by Monday. I would spend the weekend doing what I had done every weekend for the last 8 years, reviewing the books, closing out the month, reconciling the operating account. But this time, I would also be doing 3 other things. First, I would print a hard copy of the operating agreement, every quarterly financial statement, and the capital contribution records, and I would put them in a black leather portfolio that my husband David gave me for our 5th anniversary. Second, I would email Brett Holloway. Third, I would do absolutely nothing to signal to my parents or my brother that I knew. Saturday morning, I sat at the desk in my home office and wrote Brett an email. I kept it very short. I wrote, "Brett, I understand you'll be at the Beaumont family Thanksgiving on Thursday. I'd like to request 15 minutes of your time before dinner to review the Q3 financials and a governance matter. I'll arrive at my parents' house at 3:30 p.m. Could we meet in my father's study at that time? Claire." Brett wrote back in under an hour. He wrote, "Claire, I'll be there at 3:15. I want to tell you something about Brett Holloway. Brett is 72 years old. He was my grandfather Harlan's business partner on 2 different commercial projects in the 1990s. And when Grandpa Harlan convinced my father to start Beaumont and Reeve as a cabinet shop in 2003, Grandpa Harlan also convinced my father to retain Brett as an outside business advisor for an annual fee. Brett is a retired construction executive. He has a CCIM designation. He has seen more family businesses implode than anyone I have ever met. Brett has also, quietly, been on my side since the day I joined the company. In 2019, when my father installed Trent as VP of Business Development, Brett called me from his car in the Costco parking lot in Hendersonville and said, "Claire, you are the one building this thing. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And don't you dare quit on me." I have thought about that phone call twice a week for 5 years. Brett was, in every meaningful sense, the one adult at Beaumont and Reeve who had always treated my signature as worth something. I did not tell Brett what I was planning. I did not have to. Brett is 72 years old and has been reading rooms since before I was born. When he agreed to meet me at 3:15 on Thanksgiving afternoon, he already knew something was wrong. Sunday night, David sat across from me at our kitchen table and asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this at the dinner. David is a 41-year-old structural engineer. He is 6'4". He has been my husband for 6 years. He has never, in all that time, tried to rescue me from my family. He has only ever asked me what I needed. I said, "David,
if I file the derivative action before Thanksgiving, my parents will spend the rest of their lives telling the extended family that I ambushed them, that I didn't give them a chance to make it right, that I wouldn't even come to dinner. 20 years from now, at a funeral, my Aunt Louisa will still be saying, "Claire just couldn't wait." David said, "And if they ambush you at dinner first?" I said, "Then the record shows that I walked in good faith, that I sat at their table, that I was handed the paperwork, and that I responded with my own paperwork. Everything after that is documented." David nodded, slowly, the way he does when he's already run the calculation in his head. Then he said, "What do you need from me Thursday?" I said, "I need you to drive. I need you to sit next to me. I need you to not say a single word unless someone asks you a direct question. And I need you to take my portfolio out to the car at exactly 8:45 p.m., whether dinner is over or not." David said, "Done." Monday morning, I walked into Beaumont and Reeve at 7:30 a.m., like I always do. I made coffee in the break room. I said good morning to Marisol at the front desk. I went upstairs to my office, opened my laptop, and started the week. My father came in at 9. He walked past my office without stopping. This had been his habit since Tuesday. Trent did not come in at all that day. According to the Outlook calendar I could see, he was in Charlotte. At 11:04 a.m., my father's assistant Gloria forwarded me an email that she had been CC'd on by mistake. The email was from Peter Lansdowne at South Mark Capital. It was addressed to my father and to Trent. The subject line read, LOI, Beaumont and Reeve, Revised Draft V4. I opened it. Inside was a letter of intent. The purchase price was $11.2 million for 100% of the membership interests. The closing was targeted for the end of Q1. The letter referenced a prior draft. It referenced due diligence timelines. It referenced, and this is the part I read twice, a simplified capitalization structure to be effectuated prior to closing, consistent with sellers' prior representations. A simplified capitalization structure, consistent with sellers' prior representations. I read that phrase 4 times. Then I forwarded the email to Evan at Priestley and Goss with one line. They told Southmark the cap table is 60-40 between mom and dad. They have been representing to a buyer that I don't exist as a member. Evan called me back in 9 minutes. He said, "Claire, this is a fraudulent inducement. They have misrepresented the ownership of the company to a third-party buyer in signed correspondence. That's actionable by you, and separately, that's actionable by Southmark when they find out." I said, "What do I do Monday morning after Thanksgiving?" Evan said, "Claire, listen to me very carefully. You do not do anything to tip them off. You go to work on Tuesday and Wednesday like a normal week. You go to Thanksgiving dinner. You let them hand you whatever they are going to hand you. And on the Monday after Thanksgiving, which is December 1st, I am going to file 3 documents in a sequence we will agree on Friday. 1. A notice of derivative action naming your parents and your brother as breaching fiduciary duty. 2. A cease and desist letter to Southmark Capital notifying them that any transaction without your consent is void and that the sellers have misrepresented the capitalization. 3. A letter to First Piedmont Bank requesting immediate review of the change of control default provision on the line of credit. I said, Evan, I also want something else. He said, tell me. I said, I want a fourth letter. I want a letter to the Women Business Owners Council certification body. Beaumont and Reeve is certified as a minority-owned business through my 40% interest as a female member. That certification is worth roughly $400,000 a year in specified public contracts. I want the council notified that the ownership has been misrepresented, and I want them to suspend the certification pending review. Evan was quiet for a beat. Then he said, Claire Beaumont, remind me never to cross you. I said, Evan, I'm not crossing anyone. I'm reading them back their own paperwork. I am going to pause for a second because I want to tell you what that week felt like. From the outside, I was a woman having a normal Monday. I ate a turkey sandwich at my desk. I approved a purchase order for hinges. I signed off on a referral bonus for one of our foremen. I ran a payroll. I took a call from a client in Charleston who wanted a change order on a butler's pantry. From the inside, I was a woman watching her parents and her brother sign documents they had no legal authority to sign on behalf of a company that was 40% mine. And I was making a decision I had been avoiding for 4 years. The decision was not whether to fight. I had already made that decision by Tuesday afternoon in my office, 8 seconds of silence ago. The decision was whether to walk away from Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, the company I had saved, the company I had built, the company with my name on the sign out front, or to fight for it. Tuesday night, I sat in my home office and looked at an Excel spreadsheet I had been building for 3 years without telling anyone. The tab was labeled Beaumont Exit. It modeled out 3 scenarios. Scenario A, sale at current multiple, 40% of after-tax proceeds to me. Scenario B, buyout of my interest by my parents at fair market value using a cross-purchase agreement. Scenario C, I walk, I sue, I collect. I closed the laptop. I went downstairs. David was making pasta. I said, David, I don't want scenario A, B, or C. He said, which one do you want? I said, I want scenario D. He said, what's scenario D? I said, I buy them out. David stopped stirring the pasta. He said, Claire, are you serious? I said, Beaumont and Reeve is worth about $14 million on a sale multiple. The EBITDA is 2.2. I have 40%. I have a right of first refusal that triggers on any transfer to a third party. Southmark is offering 11.2, which means they think they can squeeze working capital and pay themselves back inside of 4 years. I think the real value is closer to 16. And I think the plant we just put in has another 3 years of growth in it. If I trigger my right of first refusal, I can match Southmark's offer for my parents' 60% at a pro rata price. That's $6.7 million for mom and dad's combined interest. I have $600,000 in cash, $900 in the brokerage, and a pre-approved SBA 7A commitment from Piedmont Heritage Bank in Winston-Salem that I've been sitting on for 14 months. David said, Claire, why have you been sitting on an SBA loan commitment for 14 months? I said, because I thought someday I might need it. I did not know it was going to be for this. David sat down at the kitchen table. Then he said, okay, Tell me what you need. I said, I need a cosigner on the second tranche of the SBA. I need you to talk to your parents about a short-term bridge. And I need you to understand that I am about to put everything we have into a company that my own mother will, by the end of the week, tell every human being at her church that I stole from her. David said, Claire, I was going to say yes before you finished the sentence. But I'm going to say something else first. You are not stealing anything. You are buying what is already yours. I want to tell you honestly, and this is the closest thing I'm going to say to a hard emotion in this whole story, that I did not cry when my father told me the company was always going to go to Trent. I did not cry when I read the LOI that pretended I did not exist. I cried for about 90 seconds in my husband's arms that Tuesday night in our kitchen with pasta water boiling over onto the stove because I realized for the first time that I was not alone. Then I blew my nose, I turned off the stove, and I went back upstairs to work. Wednesday was the last workday before Thanksgiving. The office closed at noon. I spent the morning doing 3 things. First, I called Joel Amaker, the senior vice president at Piedmont Heritage Bank in Winston-Salem, who had pre-approved the SBA 7A commitment. I told him, without going into detail, that I was likely to draw on the facility within 30 days. Joel said that was fine. He asked if the transaction would involve Beaumont and Reeve. I said yes. Joel said, Claire, I've been waiting for this call for over a year. I did not ask him what he meant. Joel has a reputation in the Southeast mid-market, and bankers like Joel do not say things like that unless they already know. Second, I called my grandfather's old estate attorney, a woman named Meredith Vance, and asked her a question I had never asked before. I asked her whether my grandfather's letter from 2017, the handwritten one saying, "This is for whatever you decide is worth building," had any companion documents, any side letters, any amendments to his will, anything Meredith had held for me that I did not know existed. Meredith was quiet for a second. Then she said, Claire, there is a memorandum your grandfather signed 2 weeks before he passed. It's not a legal instrument. It's a memorandum of understanding. It documents that the $480,000 was a capital contribution to Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, not a gift to your parents, not a loan to you, not a family distribution. Your grandfather wanted it on the record. It's dated February 3rd, 2017. I said, Meredith, why have I never seen this document? She said, because the instructions were to provide it to you only if you asked. Harlan said, and I'm quoting him, Claire knows how to keep her own records. She'll ask when she needs it. I put the phone down on my desk, and I closed my eyes, and I counted. 6 seconds. I counted. Then I asked Meredith to email me a copy. She had it to me within the hour. Third, I printed everything. I printed the 2017 operating agreement. I printed the 2017 capital contribution schedule. I printed the wire confirmation. I printed Grandpa Harlan's memorandum. I printed every quarterly financial statement from 2021 to Q3 2024. I printed the corrupted Lansdowne LOI with the simplified capitalization language highlighted in yellow. I printed Evan Priestley's draft notice of derivative action, unfiled but ready. I printed the minority-owned business certification paperwork. and I printed one single page, a memo I had written the night before on plain letterhead, titled Proposal, Internal Acquisition of Majority Interest by Claire E. Beaumont, CFO. I put all of it into the black leather portfolio. I zipped it closed at 11:43 a.m. Wednesday morning. I went home and made pie crust. Thanksgiving morning, the sky over Asheville was the color of pewter, and the temperature was 34 degrees. I woke up at 6. I ran 4 miles. I came home, showered, and put on a navy wool dress that I had bought in Charlotte 3 months earlier and kept in the back of my closet with the tags on. David asked me if I wanted him to wear the gray suit or the blue one. I said, the gray one. The blue one looks like you're going to a funeral. He said, Claire, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're going to a funeral. I laughed for the first time in 11 days. We loaded the car at 2:45, 2 pies, apple and pecan, a bottle of the 2019 Barolo we had been saving, the black leather portfolio, my car keys, David's car keys. We left the house at 2:55 for the 15-minute drive to my parents' place in Biltmore Forest. In the car, David asked me a question that he had been waiting all week to ask. He said, Claire, what if it doesn't go the way you think it's going to go? I said, David, I am not hoping anything goes any particular way. I am bringing the paperwork. They are going to do what they are going to do. And then the paperwork is going to do what the paperwork is going to do. I'm not the main character of this story tonight. The operating agreement is. David was quiet for a block. Then he said, That is the scariest thing I have ever heard you say. I said, I know. Right now, I'm in the passenger seat of my husband's car, 2 minutes from my parents' driveway, with a black leather portfolio on my lap that contains 22 pages of notarized paper and the future of a $14 million company. If you have ever walked into a room where everyone who was supposed to love you has decided you are disposable, and you had to keep your face perfectly still, drop a like on this video. This one's for you. And before you keep watching, I have a question for you. Would you have gone to that Thanksgiving dinner at all? Or would you have called from the car and told them to open the manila envelope themselves? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll read them after I tell you what happened when I walked through my parents' front door. My parents' house sits on a 3/4-acre lot at the end of a cul-de-sac in Biltmore Forest. It is a 2-story brick colonial with black shutters and a boxwood hedge that my mother has pruned into submission for 23 years. When David and I pulled into the driveway at 3:11 p.m., there were already 6 cars there. Uncle Marcus's Lexus, Aunt Louisa's Subaru, my cousin Peter's pickup, my great-aunt Harriet's sedan, Trent's BMW, and, parked closest to the walkway, an unremarkable silver Camry that I knew belonged to Brett Holloway. I counted cars while David parked. Then I sat in the passenger seat for 8 more seconds with my hand on the portfolio. David said, "Do you want a minute?" I said, "No, I'm ready." I walked up the brick path in my navy dress and my black leather ankle boots, carrying a bottle of Barolo in my right hand and the portfolio under my left arm. David carried both pies. My mother opened the door before we rang the bell because my mother has always watched the driveway. She said, "Claire, You look so thin. Come in, come in. Brett is already here. Your father is showing him the new bookshelves in the study. She kissed the air next to my cheek. I said, Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. I walked through the foyer with the portfolio tucked against my hip, turned left past the dining room where my mother had laid out the long table for 19 with the good china and the crystal and the silver napkin rings, and went straight to my father's study. My father and Brett were standing by the bookshelves. Brett turned when I came in. He has kind, heavy-lidded brown eyes, a full head of white hair, and a handshake that has not gotten weaker in the 23 years I have known him. I said, Dad, Brett, I'd like the three of us to meet for 15 minutes before dinner. My father said, Claire, we've got guests. Can this wait? Brett said, before I could answer, Howard, I requested the meeting. It's a Q3 review, 15 minutes. Everybody else can have another drink. My father did not know what to do with that. He looked at me. He looked at Brett. Then he said, Fine, 15 minutes. I closed the study door. I sat down in the leather wingback chair by the fireplace. Brett sat in the matching chair across from me. My father sat at his desk. I opened the portfolio. I said, Dad, Brett, I want to walk you both through the Q3 financials, and I want to discuss a governance matter that needs to be resolved before the end of the calendar year. My father said, Claire, whatever you want to discuss, we can handle it after dinner. I said, we can handle it now, or we can handle it at the dinner table in front of Aunt Louisa and Uncle Marcus and Great Aunt Harriet. Your choice. Brett looked at my father. My father's jaw moved. He said, Fine, go ahead. I pulled out the Q3 statements first. I walked them through the numbers. Revenue, $12.1 million year to date, up 19%. Gross margin, 31.4%, up 140 basis points. EBITDA, 2.2 trailing 12 months. Operating cash flow, 1.8. The pre-construction pipeline booked through Q3 of the following year. Brett nodded. He always nods when numbers come out of my mouth. He has been doing this for 8 years. My father did not nod. My father had figured out at some point in the last 90 seconds that this was not a Q3 review. Then I said, Now, the governance matter. I pulled out the second document. I said, Dad, last Tuesday when we were sitting in your office, you told me that the company was always going to go to Trent. I wrote that down at 4:17 p.m. with a timestamp. On Monday of this week, I received a forwarded email sent to me by mistake from Peter Lansdowne at Southmark Capital. That email contained a revised LOI, version 4, valuing the company at $11.2 million. The LOI references a simplified capitalization structure consistent with sellers' prior representations. I slid the printed LOI across the coffee table to my father. I said, Dad, what are sellers' prior representations? My father did not answer. I said, Dad, Brett, I have been the CFO and a 40% member of Beaumont and Reeve Millwork since April 17th, 2017. I have had no member meetings. I have had no notification of any transaction. I have had no request for consent, and I have just been shown by accident that you and Trent have been representing to a third-party buyer that the company's ownership is 60-40 between you and Mom, with no mention of my 40% interest. That is a fraudulent misrepresentation to a buyer. That is a breach of fiduciary duty to me as a member, and that is a violation of sections 4.2, 4.3, 6.1, and 7.2 of the operating agreement that you signed on April 17th, 2017. I set a printed copy of the operating agreement on the coffee table, open to page 9 with the highlighted sections. My father looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Claire, this is a family matter."
Brett Holloway, who had not said anything for 6 full minutes, set his coffee cup down on a coaster on my father's desk. Brett said, "Howard, this is not a family matter. This is a securities matter. I am telling you that as the outside advisor your father hired me to be. I am telling you that as a man who has watched family businesses blow up for 40 years. What your daughter is describing to you is a federal and state liability problem, and I am not going to sit at your dinner table tonight and eat turkey while you pretend it isn't." My father opened his mouth. He closed it. I said, "Dad, I have a proposal. Before we walk out there and have dinner with 19 people, I want you to understand what is going to happen, and I want to give you a path where nobody at that table ever has to know what this conversation was about. Here is the proposal." I slid the third document across. I said, "I am offering to buy you and Mom out, $6.7 million for your combined 60%. That matches the Southmark offer on a pro rata basis. I have an SBA commitment from Piedmont Heritage Bank in Winston-Salem. I have additional financing lined up. You can walk out of Beaumont and Reeve with the equivalent of the Southmark payday starting January 2nd. And nobody ever knows this conversation happened. You announce a retirement. Trent keeps his title. I run the company, which I already run. You get your money. I get the company I already built." My father said, "Claire, we are not going to sell the company to you." I said, "Dad, I am asking nicely. One time." My father said, "No." Brett closed his eyes for a full 3 seconds. I said, "Okay." I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I put the proposal back into the portfolio. I put the operating agreement on top of it. I zipped the portfolio closed. I said, "Dad, Brett, I think we should go to dinner." I stood up. I walked out of the study with the portfolio under my arm. I did not look back to see if my father was following. The dining room at my parents' house seats 19 when the leaves are in. My mother had put all 3 leaves in. She had used her grandmother's tablecloth, the ivory damask one with the hand-embroidered hem. The centerpiece was a low arrangement of white hydrangeas and bronze-colored mums. There were 4 candles burning. The good china had the gold rim. The water glasses were crystal. The napkin rings were sterling. The seating from the head of the table going clockwise was my father, Aunt Louisa, Uncle Marcus, my cousin Peter and his wife Kendra, my cousin Daniel, Great Aunt Harriet, Brett Holloway, my husband David, me, my mother at the other head, my brother Trent, Trent's girlfriend Madison, my Uncle Royce, my Aunt Celeste, my cousin Amelia, my cousin Bryson, and his wife Wendy. 19 people total, 18 Beaumonts and Beaumont adjacent relatives, plus Brett. My mother said grace. She always says grace. It was 45 seconds long, and it thanked God for family, for the new fabrication plant. She said Howard's new plant, not the company's new plant, and I noted that, and for all of us being together. Then she served the turkey. For the first 42 minutes of dinner, everything was normal. Aunt Louisa told the same story about her 2004 trip to Tuscany that she tells every Thanksgiving. Uncle Marcus argued with Cousin Peter about college football. Great Aunt Harriet asked David about his work and listened to his answer. Trent was performing, loudly, charmingly, for his girlfriend and his cousins. He was on his third glass of wine. He was telling a story about closing a $40,000 change order on a beach house in Kiowa, and he was telling it as though he had done it alone, when in fact, I had written the change order and Marisol had priced it. I ate. I complimented my mother's stuffing. I let Brett refill my wine glass once. At 6:47 p.m., my father stood up at the head of the table with a water glass in his hand. He said, "Before dessert, I want to make an announcement." I set my fork down. I counted. 4 seconds. I counted. My father said, "For those of you who haven't heard, we at Beaumont and Reeve have been in conversations with a terrific firm out of Charlotte about what we're calling a strategic partnership. This has been in the works for several months. I am pleased to tell this family tonight that we expect to finalize this partnership in the first quarter of next year, and that it represents a tremendous outcome for everything our family has built." There were sounds of congratulation around the table. Aunt Louisa said, "Howard, that's wonderful." Uncle Marcus raised his glass. My father was not finished. He said, "I also want to announce tonight that as part of this transition, our leadership at Beaumont and Reeve will be evolving. Trent will be taking on an expanded role. And Claire has been working incredibly hard for many years, and we all appreciate that. Claire is going to be transitioning out of the CFO position to focus on her family and her consulting work. Nobody at the table, including my husband, knew I had any consulting work." My father reached down to a sideboard next to his chair and picked up a manila envelope. He walked around the table. He stopped behind my chair. He set the manila envelope down next to my water glass. He said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Claire, honey, these are the papers. Just sign them before dessert and we can all celebrate." My mother was smiling. Trent was smiling. Madison was looking at Trent. Brett Holloway was staring at my father with an expression I had never seen on him before. I reached down under my chair and I picked up the black leather portfolio. I set it on the tablecloth next to the manila envelope. I said, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not stand up, and I did not cry. "Dad, before I open your envelope, I'd like to ask the table's permission to share a few documents of my own. It will take about 4 minutes. I promise nobody's pie is going to get cold." My mother said, "Claire, honey, we're having a nice dinner. Let's not do this now." I said, "Mom, the envelope Dad just placed next to my water glass is a voluntary resignation and a transfer of a 40% membership interest in Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, LLC, from me to the company for 0 consideration. I'm not signing it. And before anyone else at this table drinks any more wine, I think everybody here is entitled to understand what my father and brother have just asked me to sign." The table went quiet. Aunt Louisa set down her fork. My father said, "Claire." I said, "Dad, I'm going to talk for 4 minutes. Then I'm going to eat my pie. Please sit down." Brett Holloway said, "Howard, sit down." My father sat down. I opened the portfolio. I pulled out the operating agreement first. I held it up so the table could see it. I said, "This is a 22-page operating agreement for Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, LLC. It was signed on April 17th, 2017. It was notarized. It was filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State. It is signed by my father, Howard Beaumont. It is signed by my mother, Lorraine Beaumont. It is signed by me, and it grants me, Claire Elise Beaumont, a 40% membership interest in Beaumont and Reeve Millwork, LLC, in exchange for a capital contribution of $480,000, which I wired to the company operating account on the same date." I pulled out the wire confirmation. I put it on the table. I said, "This is the wire confirmation. $480,000 from the brokerage account of my late grandfather, Harlan Beaumont." I pulled out Grandpa Harlan's memorandum. I said, "This is a memorandum signed by Grandpa Harlan 2 weeks before he died, stating that the $480,000 he left me in February of 2017 was intended as a capital contribution into Beaumont and Reeve Millwork. He had Meredith Vance hold it for me until I asked for it. I asked for it yesterday." Great Aunt Harriet, who is 81 years old and was Grandpa Harlan's sister, put her hand over her mouth. She said, out loud to the whole table, "Harlan did that?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, he did." I pulled out the Lansdowne LOI. I said, "This is a letter of intent from Southmark Capital, version 4, dated last week. It offers $11.2 million for 100% of the membership interest in Beaumont and Reeve Millwork. It was forwarded to me on Monday by my father's assistant, Gloria, who CC'd me by mistake. The letter references, and I'm reading directly from the document, a simplified capitalization structure consistent with sellers' prior representations. That sentence means that my father and my brother have been representing to Southmark Capital that the ownership of this company is 60% my father, 40% my mother. No mention of me. No mention of the 40% I have held for 8.5 years. That is a material misrepresentation to a third-party buyer in signed correspondence. That is securities fraud. That is fraud on me. And the envelope my father just placed next to my water glass is the cover-up. A forced resignation and an uncompensated transfer designed to make the cap table match what he already told Southmark 2 weeks ago. Uncle Marcus, who is a civil engineer and who has known my father for 38 years, said, "Howard, is this true?" My father did not answer. I said, "Uncle Marcus, I'm going to make this easy." I slid the operating agreement across the table to him. I said, "Page 3, Section 2.4, Membership Interests." Uncle Marcus put on his reading glasses. He read for about 15 seconds. Then he looked up and he looked at my father and he said, "And Uncle Marcus has never in his life raised his voice at my father. He said, 'Howard, what did you do?'" My father started to say something. I cut him off. I said, "Dad, I'm not done." I pulled out the 5th document. I said, "This is a draft notice of derivative action.
It names you, Mom, and Trent as defendants. It alleges breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation to a buyer, and unlawful attempt to dilute a member without consent. It will be filed at 9 o'clock Monday morning in Buncombe County Superior Court by my attorney, Evan Priestley, unless I call him before 8 a.m. and tell him not to. I pulled out the 6th document. I said, "This is a cease and desist letter to Peter Lansdowne at Southmark Capital."
It notifies Southmark that any transaction involving Beaumont and Reeve Millwork without my written consent is void, and that the sellers have misrepresented the capital structure. It will be sent by Evan Priestley's office on Monday. I pulled out the 7th document. I said, "This is a letter to First Piedmont Bank on the company's line of credit. The credit facility, which I renegotiated in 2019, contains a change of control default provision. Any unauthorized attempt to transfer membership interests triggers a review. That letter goes on Monday as well." I pulled out the 8th document. I said, "This is a letter to the Women Business Owners Council. Beaumont and Reeve is currently certified as a minority-owned business through my 40% female member interest. That certification is worth approximately $400,000 a year in public sector and large institutional contracts, including the contract we have with the Asheville school system and the contract we have with Mission Health. The council will be notified that the ownership structure has been misrepresented, and I will request a pending review suspension of the certification until the matter is resolved." I closed the portfolio. I said, "Dad, Mom, Trent, I gave you a path in the study 40 minutes ago. I offered to buy you out at a fair price. You said no. So here is what is now happening. On Monday morning, Evan Priestley will file the derivative action. Southmark will receive the cease and desist. The bank will receive the change of control letter. The certification will be suspended. The Southmark deal is dead. The certification is frozen. The line of credit is under review. And by the end of next week, every institution that writes a check to Beaumont and Reeve will know that the ownership of this company is not what you told them it was." The room was silent. My mother was not smiling anymore. Trent had gone the color of the linen tablecloth. Brett Holloway stood up. Brett said, "I have been the outside advisor to this company for 21 years. I have watched Claire build this business. I was in the room on April 17th, 2017, in Evan Priestley's office in Charlotte. I flew in for that meeting because Harlan asked me to. I watched her sign the check. I watched her parents sign the operating agreement. And I am telling every person at this table tonight that what Claire Beaumont has just described to you is the truth. And what her parents and brother attempted to do to her tonight is one of the most brazen breaches of fiduciary duty I have seen in 4 decades in this industry. I will be resigning my advisory role with Beaumont and Reeve effective tonight, and I will be sending the NC Bar Association a letter on Monday documenting the events of this evening because I am a material witness." Brett sat down. Aunt Louisa, who is my mother's older sister, who taught high school English for 31 years, who has never in my memory raised her voice, looked at my mother across the table and she said, "Lorraine, you should be ashamed of yourself."
My mother started to cry, but not quietly. Not the way women cry at funerals. She cried the way people cry when they are trying to get something. She said, "Claire, honey, why would you do this in front of everyone? Why would you embarrass your father like this? We're your family." I did not answer her. My father pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up. He walked, not to me, not to my mother, not to Trent, but to the sideboard, where he picked up the manila envelope he had placed next to my water glass 15 minutes earlier. He carried it to the kitchen. I heard him drop it into the trash compactor under the sink. Then I heard him turn the trash compactor on. He did not come back to the table. Trent, to his credit, and I am going to say this once, and I am not going to say it again. Trent looked down at his plate and said in a very small voice, "I didn't know about Grandpa's memorandum." I swear to God, I didn't know about the memorandum. I said, "Trent, the memorandum is not what matters. The operating agreement is what matters. And you have seen the operating agreement 8 times because I have given it to you 8 times. I gave you a copy in 2019 when Dad made you VP. I gave you a copy in 2020 when we closed on the plant. I gave you a copy in 2022 when we restructured the credit facility. I emailed you a copy last March." "You never read it," Trent said. "I didn't read it." I said, "I know." David took my hand under the table. He did not squeeze it. He just held it. I looked at my watch. It was 7:19 p.m. I said, loud enough for the table to hear, "I think we're going to head out. Aunt Louisa, thank you for coming. Uncle Marcus, thank you for reading the document. Brett, thank you. Great Aunt Harriet, thank you for remembering Grandpa Harlan. Mom, I hope you have a good Thanksgiving. Trent, I'll see you at the office on Monday for exactly 1 day, because starting Tuesday, the locks on my office and the server closet will be changed, and you will be on paid administrative leave pending the derivative action." Trent said, "Claire, you can't do that." I said, "Trent, I'm the CFO. I wrote the HR policy. I can do that." I stood up. David stood up. I picked up my portfolio and I walked out of that dining room, out through the foyer, out through the front door, down the brick path my mother had swept that morning, to the car. I did not turn around once. David drove us home. I did not cry in the car. I did not cry at the stoplight on Biltmore Avenue. I did not cry when we pulled into our driveway. I cried for exactly 6 minutes, sitting on the edge of our bed in my navy wool dress with my shoes still on, and then I stopped. I took a shower. I got into pajamas. David brought me a bowl of apple pie. We watched the last hour of the Dallas Cowboys game. At 11:58 p.m., my phone lit up with a text from Brett Holloway. It said, "Claire, in 34 years, I have never been prouder of a professional I have worked with than I am of you tonight. Your grandfather would have been standing on the table. B." I did not text him back that night. I texted him back in the morning. I said, "Brett, thank you for standing up." Monday at 9, Conference Room A. He wrote back, "I'll be there." Monday morning, December 1st, I was at my desk at Beaumont and Reeve at 7:15 a.m. I had changed into a charcoal suit. I had a second coffee. I had Evan Priestley on the phone at 7:22. Evan said, "Claire, we're filing at 9. I said, "File it." At 9:04 a.m., the notice of derivative action was filed in Buncombe County Superior Court. Evan's paralegal called me with the case number at 9:11.
At 9:30 a.m., the cease and desist letter was sent by certified mail and by email to Peter Lansdowne at Southmark Capital. It was also sent to Southmark's general counsel. At 9:45 a.m., Peter Lansdowne called Evan's office. He had read the letter. He was calm. He asked exactly 2 questions. He asked whether I was the 40% member he had not been told existed, and he asked whether I had any interest in continuing discussions with Southmark, independently of my parents, as the incoming majority owner. Evan called me at 9:52 to relay that question.
I said, "Tell Peter I will call him Wednesday. Tell him my answer is probably not, but I'll hear him out." At 10:15 a.m., Joel Amaker at Piedmont Heritage Bank called me directly. He said, "Claire, I saw the filing. Whenever you're ready to draw, we're ready to fund." At 10:40 a.m., First Piedmont Bank's commercial lending group notified my father in writing that the line of credit on Beaumont and Reeve was being placed into a 30-day default review pending resolution of the change of control trigger. The line was frozen effective that business day. The outstanding balance, $850,000, was not accelerated, but no further draws were permitted. At 11:22 a.m., the Women Business Owners Council emailed Evan's office to acknowledge receipt of my letter. They confirmed that the minority-owned business certification for Beaumont and Reeve would be placed into pending review status within 48 hours. 2 contracts, the Asheville School System contract and the Mission Health Preferred Vendor contract, immediately went into a suspension window. At 12:08 p.m., my father attempted to enter the server room at Beaumont and Reeve. The badge reader rejected his credentials. I had asked our IT contractor to revoke administrative access at 7:45 that morning, pending the derivative action. My father walked to my office. My door was open. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway. He did not speak. I did not speak. He walked back down the hallway. At 2:30 p.m., Trent's personal attorney, a man I had never met named Colin Sharp, called Evan to discuss terms of a separation. Evan declined the call. Evan sent Colin Sharp a 1-page letter advising that, per Section 8.3 of the operating agreement, any compensation paid to Trent in violation of fiduciary duty was subject to clawback. The total potential clawback was identified as $418,000. At 4:45 p.m., Brett Holloway's resignation letter arrived at my parents' house by FedEx overnight as a courtesy formality. The letter copied the NC Bar Association, as Brett had promised. By 5:30 p.m. Monday, less than 10 hours after filing, the deal with Southmark was dead. The credit line was frozen. The minority certification was suspended. Trent was facing a clawback. My father had lost access to the server room in his own company, and Brett had put the whole thing on the record. That is what the paperwork did. The family fallout sorted itself out over about 3 weeks. Aunt Louisa called me Friday after Thanksgiving. She cried on the phone for about 40 seconds, which is a long time for Aunt Louisa. And then she apologized for every time she had ever said I was dramatic, every time she had told my mother I was too much, every time she had taken my mother's side for 54 years. She did not ask for anything. She asked me if she could come to lunch. I said yes. Uncle Marcus sent me a handwritten card. Inside the card, he had written 4 sentences. He wrote, Claire, I knew something was wrong at that table. I did not know how long it had been wrong or how wrong. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Whatever you need, ask. Great Aunt Harriet called me from her living room the next weekend. She said Grandpa Harland would have been proud. Then she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, Claire, your grandfather told me once that he had left you that money because he knew you were the only one of the grandchildren who would treat it like it was the beginning of something, not the end of something. He was right. My cousin Peter apologized. My cousin Amelia apologized. My cousin Bryson's wife, Wendy, who I had always thought did not like me, sent me a text that said simply, "Good for you." My mother did not apologize.
My mother sent an 11-page letter through her attorney on the Tuesday after the derivative action was filed, asking me to withdraw it in exchange for a written apology. I read the letter once. I put it in the file. I did not respond. My father, through Colin Sharp, proposed a buyout. It was not the buyout I had offered in the study. It was a worse buyout for him because the court had already dismissed Southmark, the credit line was frozen, and the minority certification was suspended. By the time we mediated in late January, the company was worth less than it had been on November 28th because of what his own fraudulent representation had done to it. I paid him and my mother combined $5.9 million for their 60% interest. That was $800,000 less than I had offered them in the study on Thanksgiving. Their attorneys told them to take it. They took it. Trent accepted a separation package of $0 and a full release of the $418,000 clawback, contingent on him not working in the architectural millwork industry in the Southeast for 3 years. He signed it. He moved to Atlanta. I did not speak to my parents for 11 months. 6 months after Thanksgiving, I walked into the Beaumont and Reeve fabrication plant on a Tuesday morning in May. The sign on the front of the building had been repainted. It no longer said Beaumont and Reeve Millwork. It said Beaumont and Reeve Millwork in the same font, but there was a line underneath that read A Claire Beaumont Company. I had added that line in March, not because I needed it, because the 41 people who worked there had asked for it. David and I bought the Biltmore Forest house next door to our old one. It is on a quiet street, and my mother-in-law lives 2 blocks away. The house has a garden that my husband has been tending on weekends. We have a dog now, a rescue mutt named Harlan, because I am not subtle. Brett Holloway rejoined the company in February as the chair of an advisory board I set up. He is paid a reasonable stipend. He comes to quarterly board meetings. He sits at the head of the table in the conference room he helped me design. Meredith Vance, Grandpa Harlan's estate attorney, sent me a note in March. She wrote, "Claire, your grandfather would be very proud of you. I think he knew." I framed the note. It sits on the same shelf as the handwritten letter from 2017, the one that said, "This is for whatever you decide is worth building. I built this." Last month, my father reached out through a cousin. He said he wanted to meet. I said not yet. I may say yes eventually. I have not decided. What I have decided is that if and when I meet him again, it will be in a room I choose, at a time I choose, with a witness I choose. That is not cruelty. That is architecture. If you made it this far, thank you. I want to say something directly to the women who have been told,
quietly or loudly that the family business was always going to go to someone else, that you are too much, that you are too intense, that you should be flexible, that you should not make a scene. You do not need to make a scene. You need to make a record. Keep the receipts. Keep the contracts. Keep the notarized pages. Keep the wire confirmations. Keep the handwritten letters from the people who believed in you before the people who didn't. Write down what people say to you with timestamps, even when you are certain you will never forget. Because on the day they hand you a manila envelope across a Thanksgiving table and tell you to sign, the only thing that stands between you and what they have decided for you is paper. Setting boundaries isn't revenge, it's architecture. And the best architecture starts with a load-bearing document. One question for you before you go. If you could go back and have your younger self sign one document, one contract, one agreement, one letter that would protect you from the people who were supposed to protect you, what would it be? Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'll be honest with you. The comments on this channel are the reason I keep telling these stories. If you want more stories like this one, check the description below for the playlist. And if anyone you love is about to sign something they haven't read, please, tonight, send them this video. Tell them to read the paper before dessert. Good night and happy building.